Hello. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Seth Maskett. I'm a professor of political science and director of the Center on American Politics here at the University of Denver. Thank you for joining us today for a discussion looking back on a summer of protest and activism in the Black Lives Matter movement. I want to thank the Graduate School of Social Work and the Interdisciplinary Research Institute for the Study of Inequality, or IRISE, for their support with this event today. I want to briefly mention that the Center on American Politics has a number of great discussions coming up leading up to the November election. Next Thursday, we have a discussion with Harvard political scientist Theda Skocpol about her book, Upending American Politics. Tuesday the 13th, we have a discussion about voting rights and vote suppression. You can read about these and other upcoming events on our website at du.edu/American-politics. But now for today. We have just concluded a summer like few others in American political history. Following the death of George Floyd at the hands of police on Memorial Day weekend, a series of protests cropped up in large cities and small towns all across the United States. The slogans Black Lives Matter, Defund the Police, and others quickly moved from the fringes to the center of American politics. Why this was the tipping point, whether it was due to the unusual nature of this pandemic environment or the timing or the reactions and overreactions by some political leaders or just one Black death at the hands of police too many may be unclear. But this summer's protests really reshaped American politics in a fundamental way. We're lucky to have with us a group of scholars who have been focused on these issues since well before this summer. To discuss just what we've learned and continue to learn from this period. I'm going to introduce them now, and then we'll start our discussion for the next hour. First with us is Megan Ming Francis. Megan is an associate professor of political science at the University of Washington. She's also a senior democracy fellow at the Ash Center for Democratic Governance at Harvard's Kennedy School. She specializes in the study of American politics, race, and the development of constitutional law. She's the author of the award-winning book, Civil Rights and the Making of the Modern American State, which examines the NAACP's early role in combating state-sanctioned racial violence. She's currently working on a book examining the development of the criminal justice system in the Reconstruction-era South. Also with us is Jamila Michener, who's an associate professor in the Department of Government at Cornell University, and she's the co-director of the Politics of Race, Immigration, Class, and Ethnicity Initiative. Her research focuses on poverty, racial inequality, and public policy in the United States. She's the author of Fragmented Democracy, Medicaid, Federalism, and Unequal Politics, which examines how Medicaid affects democratic citizenship. We also have with us our own Laurel Eckhouse, who's an assistant professor of political science here at the University of Denver. She studies the politics of criminal justice, racial and ethnic politics, and public law in the United States. She's currently working on a book examining the link between local political representation and the policing tactics allowed or banned in American cities. She was also a faculty affiliate with the Center on American Politics here in 2019 and 2020. And finally, we have Hakeem Jefferson, who is an assistant professor of political science at Stanford University. His research focuses on political identity and the politics of stigmatized groups. He's currently working on a book on respectability politics that examines Black American support for strong criminal enforcement laws. I want to mention that Hakeem was the organizer of an online conversation on race and justice in early June that included several of today's panelists and really proved highly influential and prophetic in its discussion of some of the issues that would soon dominate the American political discourse. You can still follow this conversation online at the hashtag Race and Justice Convo. So the way this is going to work, I'm going to ask our panelists a series of questions. We'll have a discussion about them, and then I'm going to leave some time to turn things over to you, our audience. If you have questions for the panelists, please type that in using the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window. We will do our best to answer as many of your questions as we can across the next hour. I'll be fielding some of your questions as they come in. Also, if you're interested, you'll also notice that there is a chat button down there. We'd like to use that as a chance for you to have a dialogue. If you would like to chat with each other and get sort of an ongoing discussion, You can identify yourself there by your name, where you're writing from. We do encourage that. But again, if you want to ask a question of the panelists, please use the Q&A button. Okay, so I'll open up with a question here. Large, multifaceted question, really for all our panelists, and people should feel free to answer as they want. Basically, on a policy level, okay, how effective have the protests since George Floyd's killing been? That is, what can we point to as policy changes at the local and state and federal level that have resulted from this movement? I'll also ask, are there other changes that these protests have affected? That is, has public opinion shifted? Have the issues under consideration shifted? Has there been a moving of the so-called Overton window about just what sort of ideas are open for discussion? And basically, have these protests been more or less effective than you might have expected? Anyone like to lead off on this?
I'm happy to jump in. So many brilliant people here. So I'll start so that the brilliant people don't say things and then take away all the good answers. I can get the low hanging fruit. With respect to policy, I think that there are so many things that so many policy changes that were clearly sparked by what happened by George Floyd's murder, that it would be impossible for me to even summarize them neatly here. At the state level, you have states like New York, states like Connecticut, and so on and so forth, that are passing bans on police using chokeholds, that are changing laws around. In New York, they changed repealed a law that had been in effect for a really long time, masking the records of police and complaints that had been made against them. And in Connecticut, they banned chokeholds. I mean, that's on the state level. If we turn to the local level and the city level, I mean, it's more than we can imagine, really. There's so much happening, from small local counties to big cities like Los Angeles and Austin, Texas, New York City, that have limited and significantly reduced the funding for their police departments, that have changed policies around police departments using tear gas, around police department use of force. And, none of these policies, I would say, meet the standard of being, or very few of them, I would say, meet the standard of being truly transformative. At the same time, there are things that would not have happened were it not for the kinds of discussions and demands that were sparked in the wake of George Floyd being killed, right? So policy change has most certainly happened. And I think we're just at the beginning, as far as scholarship goes, of charting these policy changes and understanding the specific kind of politics that underlie each of them. So I'll stop with that.
Maybe I'll just jump in really quickly here. So first off, really I'm grateful to Seth for organizing us, and to my fellow panelists. I echo Jamila here. I could not imagine on my second day back in teaching at UW being assembled in a group of colleagues that I admire more than this group right here. So it's great to be in community with you online. So I think this question for me begs another question that I often think about, which is, how do we measure effectiveness, right? How do we measure effectiveness in American politics, where we all kind of sit, as well as how do we measure and what do we mean when we talk about effectiveness? And so much of in terms of my first book, focuses on the NAACP's campaign against racial violence in the first quarter of the 20th century. And I remember writing that book as a graduate student, because what I got again and again from colleagues at where I went to graduate school, Princeton University, as well as outside, was that, like, well, racial violence didn't end, so this was not effective. It wasn't an effective protest and campaign. Lynchings continued, Megan. And I sat there and I was like, but wait, no, things did change. Just because that specific go in terms of Black death in the American political system did not end, a number of things also shifted as well. So I think sometimes, especially the broader public, as well as us in the discipline of political science, tend to think of kind of effective policy and effective protests as that change happened within, let's say, a year and or 6 months. And I do think that to think about what does effectiveness mean after a spring and summer of historic protests, I think we have to kind of like trouble our understanding of what perhaps effective protest might look like, right? And I think one of the quotes that I've heard again and again in terms of journalists from the spring and summer is the Martin Luther King Jr. quote in terms of like riots are the voice of the unheard, right? And so one of the things in terms of if I measure effectiveness by being heard, perhaps, right? If that's what my measure of effectiveness is, it is clear to me at least that Black people in protest and people who are their allies in this moment are actually being heard. I mean, for me, watching that terrible debate, terrible debate this week, there was a moment in between all of my cringing where I was like, wait a minute, and I think I tweeted this. Did Chris Wallace ask a question about like, how do we reimagine policing? Chris Wallace from Fox News asked Trump and Biden, what does reimagine policing might look like, huh? Like, that is a question that would not have hit the debate stage without the protest, right? Which lets me know that at least the language of even how mainstream politicians are thinking about the changes that might be required has shifted. The last thing I'll say on this, just in terms of specifically to answer your question though, so I'm situated in Seattle, Washington. Seattle, Washington has been in national headlines, CHOP, Chaz, taking over SPD here. And you've seen in terms of dramatic policy changes. The first, I'm a K through 12 public school student in Seattle. Police are going to be out of Seattle public schools. And that's because of organizers here fueled by the protest. And I'm just trying to imagine what it would have looked like for me as a Black student in high school, gone to school without police there. I think that to me, I'm just so excited about a generation of high schoolers in Seattle who don't have to have that. The other big thing, there's two other smaller big things. Well, no, two big things. There was for many years, protest around the building of a new youth jail in Seattle in the neighborhood that I live in. Members of the administration here in the Seattle City Council just were like kind of oblivious to it, didn't listen to community members, and that stopped, that changed. That they that issued in terms of like a halting to that. And then most recently, about, is it now a week, 2 weeks ago, there has been a number of proposals to defund Seattle Police Department, reinvest in community programs, and even against the veto from the mayor, the city council overrode the veto. And these are changes that will impact people's lives on the ground in Seattle that have come out of the protest of the spring and summer. So,
those are great examples. Thank you.
Yeah, so I had come in planning to have a pretty pessimistic reaction to this question. And so I'm grateful for Megan and Jamila reminding us of the things that have happened. And that kind of pessimism that I came into the room with is, we should think of it as in part kind of insulting to activists who've been on the ground for a long time, and not just post the killing and the murder of George Floyd, right? We started thinking about public reactions to police violence after the death of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. And so perhaps I'll end with some pessimism, but I'll start with a point that Megan made, which is it's sort of unfair, I think, to ask of these protests in this moment to fix or remedy centuries of state violence against Black folk. And we're seeing very contemporary manifestations of that state violence against Black people. But I'm always troubled by the question of, were these protests or those protests effective? And it's like, we've got generations, centuries of this kind of violence, and to expect that, you know, people taking to the street in any one of these moments would totally do away with that kind of violence, I think leaves us a lot to imagine. But I was just reading today, the Associated Press has some reporting out on the kinds of initiatives that activists have been calling for in terms of defunding police, moving money away from policing to these other community services that folks need and demand for everyday quality of life. And what the Associated Press has found in their study of these reform efforts is that they're much smaller than what activists want, what people have been calling for. When budget cuts have been made, they've been small. They've not been in areas where activists are calling for in particular. even in places like San Francisco and Berkeley and Oakland, and these places that we think of as progressive enclaves, even in Minneapolis, right, where city council leaders made these bold professions after these incidents that they were going to reform policing and they were going to do away and disband, all these things. And what we're seeing is that the reality is much farther away from these promises. And I think it's a reminder of a concern that a lot of politicians have, even on the local level. They've been so convinced by these people who have imagined fears of crime, of heightened crime that doesn't exist in their communities. Overwhelmingly white folks who are concerned about crime that is not visited upon them. And these local leaders are concerned about what it would mean to take money away from policing, right? What if you have an incident that takes place? And we should be aware of these political considerations, which are really, I think, constraining the manifestation of these promises that local elites made after these horrible incidents. And so I remain very hopeful because of the activism that I see on the ground. But I think activists know this, and they don't need me or anybody on the panel to tell them this, that there's a constant need to hold elected officials' feet to the fire. And this isn't happening, as many folks have pointed out, just in Republican or conservative districts. This is happening in places where Democratic politicians facing these same concerns and constraints are, I think, leaving a lot on the table. And so perhaps we can talk more about that. But I'm hopeful because of the sort of persistence of activists. But I'm a bit pessimistic. One, because I think, as all the people on the panel know, I know something about American politics and about constraints that people face. And quite frankly, white people wield a lot of power still in these places. And we'll talk about public opinion data at some point. But I think if you know the history of America, and if you know the sort of history of white folks and even white allies, I think you have great reason to be sort of pessimistic here.
Thanks for that. Laurel, did you want to weigh in on this?
I'd love to. So I think I have a couple of thoughts on this that build on some of the things that other people have said. So the first thing I want to say is that I think that Hakeem is really right, that a lot of this comes down to local politics, and not just to who supports what in local politics, but also to structural issues. So for example, if you look at Minneapolis, there were some pretty significant proposed reforms to the police, including basically getting rid of the police department and replacing it with the Department of Public Safety. And the ballot initiative to allow that was blocked by the Charter Council of Minneapolis. That's not an elected group, right? And so they're not actually, like, we can't actually blame that on concerns about electoral repercussions for those people. Instead, we have to think about, why do we have this unelected board, right? This unelected group of people who are basically a large group of elites appointed by other elites who are making decisions about what kinds of democratic choices people can even have on the ballot in Minneapolis, right? And so I think that kind of structural issue becomes really important when you think about local politics. You know, there are thousands and thousands of municipalities in this country, and they all have slightly different local politics and local structures. It's actually very complicated to get to study or get involved in local politics, because you're talking about so many different things and so many different dynamics and institutions across so many different areas. The other thing I would say is that if you look, like, one way of looking at that is this Charter Council was able to totally block this particular initiative. Another way of looking at it is, this was one gambit, right? The people in Minneapolis who are interested in changing how the city approaches public safety, in abolishing or defunding or reimagining policing in Minneapolis are still working. They're not like, oh, like, Charter Council shut us down. Now we're stuck. There's nothing for us to do, right? This kind of conflict and kind of ongoing struggle is a hallmark of all the civil rights movements that we've ever seen. And so, you know, like, we've seen scholarship that's pushed back the kind of groundwork for the civil rights movement of the 1960s, really, like, back through the 60s, back through the 50s, back to the 30s. If you look at Megan's work, really you see the roots of civil rights activism in anti-lynching activism. So you're really seeing that these struggles are generational. The problems are generational as well, but the struggles are generational and people are working on them for a really, really long time. And so I think when we try to think about effectiveness, you know, it's been a few months, right? And I think in political science, we're often looking at the marginal effect or like what can we empirically identify as the specific policy consequence of this protest. And when we do that, we miss general equilibrium effects. And I think this also speaks to Megan's work on philanthropy and our understanding of what philanthropy is worthwhile or evidence-based, right? If you're interested in a wholesale transformation of a system, you can't measure the effect of that now. One of the other thing I'd like to point to as a thing to think about in terms of how has this led to changes in American policy, as well as politics, is to think about the fact that this was one of the largest mass mobilizations in American history. And I don't think we know what that's going to look like in the long term. I think one of the things that I remember thinking about when the Standing Rock protests were happening was that they were training 200 people a day for a while in nonviolent civil disobedience tactics. That's a lot of people who can then go home and participate in protests and have this kind of base of training and base of knowledge about tactics and set of relationships, frankly, that they wouldn't have had before. What is it going to mean that we saw in rural areas? I was actually, during the protests, I was in rural Northern California. In the town that I was in was primarily white and Native, but you saw like really significant protests relative to the population of those areas in these very, very small towns. I mean, there's a town nearby that has, I think, 800 people, and you saw something like 10% of the town population out protesting. I don't know what that means, right? It certainly doesn't mean like Laytonville doesn't have racism anymore, right? But it means something that you had all of these people who are getting involved and who are having this experience of mobilizing and talking to other people in their communities and being part of this protest movement. And I don't think we know exactly how that's going to shape politics in the future.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, I have a sort of a question related to what Laura was just talking about, just, you know, how all this mobilization, how this affects other areas. What are sort of the spillover effects of this movement into other policy areas? You know, as Laura was just pointing out, you know, people are learning protesting tactics and sort of a political orientation that could affect things going forward. And I'm wondering what we've seen so far that just affects things beyond policing. You know, Jamila, I'm thinking somewhat about your own work on health policy, how there's been a lot of discussion this year about, say, how the coronavirus disproportionately affects people of color. This is a recognition we've not always seen about diseases in the middle of a pandemic, but, you know, that has possibly been a spillover of this focus this summer. And I'm curious on that or other areas, what people are seeing about spillover effects.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think there's some spillover in terms of the health policy arena. I mean, it's interesting, even because this occurred in the context of a pandemic, even the kind of organizing practices, right? Like the kind of logistics of what it took to organize the protest and to organize them on such a consistent basis and in such a wide scale way, the logistics of that required engaging with the reality of the pandemic, right? So there was no way to respond as far as protest and organizing to the racial violence without acknowledging the contours of the pandemic, right? And in a way that, at least on that scale of organizing, it sort of forced folks to also think about health. And I do think there's some siloing that happens, not across the board, but certainly like in the political world and in the organizing worlds, where there are folks who do criminal legal stuff and there are folks who do health stuff. And of course, everyone understands that in theory, these things are connected, but in practice on the ground, we can sort of mobilize and organize around them in silos. And I think one of the things that was required in this moment was that you couldn't do that. You had to think about how to both engage people around like protesting or organizing and engage them around public health, because you didn't want communities that were already being disproportionately affected to be harmed through the practices of organizing and protest. So I think that was like a natural linkage there that lent itself to some of this spillover. But I also think it matters that everyone, in the same way that Megan pointed out when she talked about a riot as the language of the unheard, it matters that everyone everywhere is suddenly wanting to hear Black people, right? In ways that, perhaps don't lead to transformative change or don't penetrate all the way to their heart and soul, right? So there's no sort of Pollyanna-ish vision here that suddenly everyone is changed and no one is racist or racism doesn't exist. But it's also true that there's an inclination to sort of learn a little bit more, hear a little bit more, and that penetrates policy areas, and in fact, probably that there's a desire to think about that in other contexts. So one of the things I found, for example, is that for folks for whom it's kind of hard to think about racism in the context of the police, because your uncle is a police officer, or you like police officers, or you've never had any bad experiences with them, or you think it's a few bad apples, when you shift and you start thinking about racism in terms of health policy, there are folks who are much more comfortable with it in that context, right? Because there's no like single like bad actor like the police who you feel ambivalent about or maybe feel positively towards. Instead, it's like health systems, and we can do that. So I think some of the spillover was like an intentional desire to shift to focusing on other areas that aren't as uncomfortable as it is to focus on the criminal legal system. But in any case, it created windows of opportunities that certainly health policy folks are leveraging, and everyone should be leveraging, honestly. I think for the most part, this spillover is a good thing, although it also, some of it is a foil. It's to distract us from the core issues that are really intractable and hard.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that the spillover question is so important. And in part, I think sometimes people are confused or forget the purpose of protest, right? The purpose of protest isn't like, I went out in the streets and cool, I'm done, right? Like protest is, for so many people, it's only the beginning part to actually address so many other issues in which kind of the normal ways that we might think to engage are not actually open, or we are not heard, right? And so I think that there's so many different spillover effects of the spring and summer of protest. Two that I'll focus on though. One, for me, it's been really interesting in this moment for many people who've been thinking about what does it mean and what does kind of the fight for civil rights actually look like, and how should we, and what should we center in our thinking about citizenship and rights making in this country. And I think for so long, the way that we've understood kind of the American political system's promise to that has been desegregated schools and the right to vote. And that like, if we provide these two to Black people, that is the responsibility, and that's kind of the limits of what the political system is actually on the hook for. In this moment though, what I've seen is a number of people, not enough, but a number of people reposition and think much more about the responsibility of the American political and legal system to protect Black people from death, right? From vigilante as well as state violence. And I think for me, one of the things that's really interesting about kind of repositioning the fight for justice, racial justice, and citizenship in this country around the protection of Black lives is that's always in terms of early 20th century and late 19th century, right? If we think about Ida B. Wells, what Black people have always said is necessary to achieve freedom and liberation in this country. And somehow, right, in the mid 20th centuries, that fell away as so many people embrace kind of a liberal ideal of America, what American democracy is. And so for me, that's been one of the things that it's been really interesting, is that people are seemingly more open to thinking about what is the responsibility of them as well as our political and legal systems in that fight to protect Black lives. The second thing is one I've been focusing a lot of attention on, which is around philanthropy. And in this moment, I have been like railing as well as many other people are around billionaire and millionaire individual donors, as well as big legacy foundations and their conceptions about what the responsibility is around racial justice and social justice, and to fund those. And for most big, especially big legacy foundations, there has been a focus on behavior change and providing in terms of social services, which is fine, right? Like people need laptops in classrooms, people need food. Black organizations that are focused on health and running, they need funding, but we also need to fund movements. If we understand how Black people get rights in this country, then social movements and funding social movements are really crucial to that. But for the most part, foundations have stayed away from funding social movements because it is very hard. And your first question here about effectiveness, it is very hard to measure what effectiveness actually means. And philanthropy has been overtaken by management consulting and using these neoliberal metrics in terms of trying to evaluate what impact actually is, right? And it's like, if I gave $1 million to Black Lives Matter, how do I measure impact in 2014, right? In terms of after the Ferguson protest, it's seemingly nothing happened, everything happened, right? We don't get the spring and summer protest here without 2014, without Ferguson, right? But like, I think that's really hard. And so it's been fascinating. $6 billion in foundation money has been committed to racial justice post this summer. Now, you know, what that breakdown looks like about what diversity program is like, kind of the shakedown, right? We don't know that yet, but it is clear that at least in terms of to Black movement giving, there has been no moment in American economic history than this moment right now. And so for me, that is a tremendous and important spillover that we should kind of focus on, especially in the coming years.
Great points. Thanks.
So
Hakeem,
I was just going to note here very, very quickly that for me, if I think about this moment, say relative to the last time we had a crazy presidential campaign in 2016, let's think about 2016 as this implicit racism moment, this space where a lot of political psychologists and psychologists like to spend their energies, and where white people have, I think, become at least a little more okay with saying that, well, we're all a little bit racist. We've all got a little bit of implicit racism. And I think we moved to this period where Black people aren't disproportionately dying from COVID because of implicit racism, right? George Floyd isn't having a knee pressed on his neck because of implicit racism, right? And so white people, I think, if I think about spillover in this way, what it's done is it's helped people to understand that this isn't just about people's psychologies. This is about structural stuff, right? This is about systemic stuff, and you can fill in an expletive there, right? This is not about the kind of implicit stuff that so many people in our business and politicians and others have become fascinated with, this idea about implicit racism. Sure, that stuff matters on the margins, but I think what this moment has done, and where I hope the biggest spillover is for people out there, is that people have a greater understanding that this isn't about whites and Blacks getting along, interpersonal stuff aside. This is about real structural stuff that's really sticky, really hard, and perhaps it's that mere acknowledgement in this moment that I can think of as a hopeful sign, and perhaps a spillover to other domains, that this is about really hard stuff that we've not dealt with for too long.
Thanks for that.
So,
yeah, Laurel.
One of the spillovers I'd like to draw attention to is that when Jamila was talking about the idea of siloing between health policy and criminal legal policy, kind of all of the other like different policy areas that we kind of look at separately, one of the things that made me think about is the amount of siloing we have in terms of tactics, right? So some people are protesters and other people do electoral politics, right? And people, you don't necessarily see that many people who are doing both protest tactics and electoral politics. This year, especially, but really as a kind of expansion of a trend that I think has started over the last four years or so, we've seen sitting senators show up at protests. We've seen city council members show up at protests. We've seen city council members get arrested and tear gassed and pepper sprayed at protests, right? We've seen members of state legislatures showing up at protests. And part of that, I think, is that we've been seeing people who are already part of activist movements get involved in politics, in electoral politics, and run for office. And that's a really interesting synergy. That's like a place where you can have outsider tactics that put pressure on institutions while having sympathetic individuals in the same, like in those offices available to respond, right? And so I think that's a huge transition and potentially a huge source of leverage and change for these social movements. This is not like totally new in American politics or anything, but I think it's an expansion of something that we've seen over that has become somewhat unusual, and that helps kind of like connect these two types of tactics. And then I also just really want to echo what Hakeem was saying about the kind of discourse about implicit bias, that this has become a way for people to turn focus away from actual like policy changes that need to happen and to do things like invest more money in police by paying for implicit bias training, which like, we don't know, like there's not really any evidence that that's going to do anything at all. And so people will do that, like focus on that partly because it kind of avoids any kind of responsibility or any kind of systemic change. And then it starts to be like, oh, let's like just change what's going on inside people's heads. And I think this year's protests have really pushed people to think about like actual structural issues. And so, so calls to do things like defund the police, focus attention not on the behavior of individual police officers or the cognitive, the cognitions of individual police officers, but instead on what police officers are doing and where public resources are going. And I think that kind of spillover effect of thinking about structural change rather than individual cognitions is just super, super important for addressing like the actual things that really produce racism in the United States.
Thank you. I have another question I want to ask, but I want to mention I've seen a few folks type in their questions for the panelists. If you do have a question for our panel, please feel free to type it in below using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. I'll just ask this, and this touches on what some of you had said previously. We saw the August shooting of Jacob Blake in Kenosha. We saw the recent virtual exonerations of the police officers involved in Breonna Taylor's killing. As these events remind us, these problems are ongoing. Even if the national dialogue may have shifted somewhat, and even if policies have shifted somewhat. And of course, the Black Lives Matter protests, which remarkably actually became somewhat more popular over the course of the summer. Some of that popularity has eroded over time. I'm wondering if you see these are these shortcomings of the movement? Are there things that could have been done better? Are these the sort of setbacks that are inevitable in any protest movement? And I'll open that up to any one of you.
Happy to jump in here. And if you hear weird sounds in the background, it's my parrot, excuse him. And I think, so I don't view the kind of continuation of both racial violence in the case of Jacob Blake and many others, and of a lack of accountability for that violence in the case of Breonna Taylor, and I'm sure many to come, as a failure or a shortcoming, or really as saying much of anything about Black Lives Matter specifically. I think it says more about the nature of this problem and the nature of the United States, right? Are institutionally from, Congress right on down to the local school board, since before the inception of the United States as such, white supremacy has been part and parcel of our political, social, and economic life. Right? So as Hakeem suggested earlier, the notion that Black Lives Matter or any movement is going to be able to undo that in a short term is just not realistic. And so it's not that I would expect that suddenly violence against Black people is going to stop, right? I think that even the responses to the examples that you mentioned in your question, Seth, speak to a kind of different context that we're operating in, right? I think, a few years ago, I kind of had developed, after Michael Brown developed a little bit of an obsession with this, and I was following those counts that various crowdsourcing outlets like The Guardian or what have you were developing of Black people having died. And I remember for a few weeks spending time just going through those databases, looking at case after case after case after case, and being struck by like the fact that Black people are always dying in this country at the hands of the police, and if not at the hands of the police, at the hands of some other kind of structural reality, right? And we don't even think about it. We take it for granted, right? It's not even really a part of our understanding of the kind of operation of the country, right? And so the fact that now it's a big deal when Breonna Taylor's killers are acquitted or even not even properly charged. And it's a big deal when Jacob Blake is murdered the way he was, and it becomes a source of additional protest, and it's shaping our discourse, and we're thinking about it and we're paying attention to it. That, I think, is the marker of the effect that the movement is having, more so than anything else. I guess the last thing I'd say is this. At the end of the day, transformational change that looks something like Black life mattering, Black people not being killed in the various ways that they are now, whether through the police or other kinds of systems, that outcome being a reality is dependent on everyone's lives changing, not just Black people. It's dependent on fundamental shifts in power, right? And resources, material resources. And that just does not come readily, because even many of the folks who don't like the fact that George Floyd was killed, who would prefer for this police violence to go away, are fundamentally, when it comes down to it, and there are choices to be made about power and resources, folks want to hold on to that. And that cannot happen, and we still have transformative change. So it's going to be hard, and it's going to be long fought.
Yeah, I was just going to note very quickly, in thinking about the downturn in public opinion, Seth, that you mentioned with respect to Black Lives Matter, I always think it necessary to point out that when we see these sort of aggregate downshifts in public opinion related to Black Lives Matter, we should be specific. And we should say that this is white people's attitudes changing and varying and being so sort of contingent on whether I have time today or not for caring about Black lives. And so the shifts that we've seen in the public opinion data has largely been among white folks who, in the sort of aftermath of George Floyd's murder, readily said to pollsters and survey interviewers that yes, I support Black Lives Matter, but I think many of us were sort of suspicious of what that meant for these respondents. And what it seemed to have meant, looking at how the data has shifted over time, is that they clearly didn't have an understanding of Black Lives Matter that I or activists on the ground have about what that entails. And so it's not to say that for some of these respondents early on in the period, that it was an empty sort of statement for them, but it was clearly not comprised by the kinds of component pieces that say that Black Lives Matter means that police have to treat Black people well all the time, et cetera. And so I think what we saw in the shift in data is that I think it was too easy early on for some white folks to express a kind of favorable view of Black Lives Matter. But I think if we were to interrogate that a little more, we would see in the early period that it didn't contain the many things that activists and others would think of when they're talking about Black Lives Matter. And so I just wanted to highlight here that this is white folks losing patience with the move toward racial justice. It is not a kind of a shift among Black folk, for example.
One of the things I always think about when we look at polling data is the 1961 polling data among white people on the Civil Rights Movement. So this is like 1961, right? Like no Voting Rights Act, no Civil Rights Act, like Black Southerners can't vote. A majority of white people said that they believed that the Civil Rights Movement had gone too far and was being counterproductive. And so that, again, I think, again, speaks to this problem of using white public opinion to measure the effectiveness of a social movement dedicated to supporting the lives of Black people. Like, that's just not, that's just like not a place that we should necessarily look as like our central measure of the effectiveness of this movement. And it's important. There are a lot of white people in this country, and they have a lot of power. And because of that, I'm not at all saying that white public opinion doesn't matter, or that we shouldn't be interested intellectually in what is going on in white public opinion related to the Black Lives Matter movement, right? As a sort of analytical question, as a way of thinking about like what are the consequences of this movement, like this is definitely an important consideration. We should keep doing that polling. At the same time, we need to be specific about what we think the mechanism for change is going to be. Right. And I think when we've talked about the policy effects that this movement has already had, we're looking at activists and organizer-driven changes in state, especially in state and local politics, and then in changes in what kinds of party coalitions seem to have some level of power. Right. I also think we would be remiss in talking about this, and especially in talking about Jacob Blake's murder, if we weren't thinking about the other kinds of movements that are happening in American politics right now. Right. So we see white partisan organizations celebrating Kyle Rittenhouse and Kyle Rittenhouse's family, right? Celebrating people who are engaging in political violence. That's a really important aspect of what's going on in American politics and in this context. And that's not something that is created by the Black Lives Matter movement. Right. And so when we're thinking about like what's the effectiveness of these protests, what's the effectiveness of the demands for Black life to be treated as like a significant, important political consideration, you got to be thinking about the fact that there are a lot of other actors moving in this space, and that those other actors also have power to shape what specific outcomes are happening. It's not like, just because we have the largest social movement or one of the largest social movements in American history, well, all of a sudden this movement gets to make all of the decisions. And so it's their fault if Breonna Taylor's killers aren't charged with anything, right? There's a lot else going on. And you have to think about that in the context of essentially a contentious political space.
Yeah, I mean, I love what everyone has said thus far. Yes, absolutely. I think the only thing that I will add to this is in terms of Laurel's comments here about that there's so many different actors in the political space, and that public opinion is one of many different ways like to measure, right? But perhaps in terms of thinking about kind of where we are at right now, post kind of the spring and summer protest, perhaps kind of a drop in white public opinion around this may not be the best way to measure this. That it is, I mean, not to say that it's not important to think about, but like in terms of, I'm not sure how much they can tell us, in part because I think that there's so many other ways that we can think about like the changes that have happened. Like in the aftermath of the spring and summer of protests. And I think that whether it's in terms of money that has been fundraised, people's language about how they talk about these protests, people's willingness to think about and talk about systemic and institutional racism, right? Like those very words, I mean, I teach, and everybody on this teaches majority white students. Right. And I say institutional racism, systemic racism all the time. And in part because I need my white students to become a little bit desensitized to it. Right. But initially when I say it, there's always like a flinching that happens, like, oh, right. I'm like, listen, this is what it is. Like your professors, I read as a Black woman, and they're like, yes, right. Like, let's just say what things actually are. And I think that like that to me is like a major change. Like I walked in Zoom, let's be clear, walked in Zoom yesterday of my class, right? Talked about racism, and the students were like, yeah, that happens, that's right. So, I mean, and in terms of like the drop in terms of public opinion, we should always expect that, right? I think that in terms of everything that we know about American political history is that racism is really difficult for white people, right? They want to read it away in a book, right? But you can't read it away, right? So you have to like, and they want it gone in like a year, but like an entrenched system over centuries is not going to be gone, not in my lifetime, right? I like to believe that there is a world in which white supremacy does not exist here in the United States, right? But I know that that's going to be here. It's going to be lessened perhaps because of the work that myself as well as the people on this call are engaged in. But that's, I think it's exhausting. Sometimes I'm like, my white friends are like, Megan, like, oh my goodness. I'm like, imagine being Black. Like how tiring is that? Like I can't disengage, right? So like I expect that. Like I want to leave. I mean, I want to not think about this. So I definitely understand like the down chick. People are like, "Ooh, this is a lot," right? So we should expect that, but we should also continue to build off of in terms of the accomplishments, in terms of the ways that we've already been building thus far.
These are really great comments. Thank you for that. You know, I'm particularly thinking about something I often teach is that like basically successful protest movements are never popular at the time that they're active. You know, whether we're talking about civil rights or women's suffrage or the labor movement or anything else, they're very unpopular, which is the point. That, you know, they're challenging, you know, basically people who are comfortable and who have a lot invested in the way things currently are. And we look back on them. You know, 50 years later, the civil rights movement looks great. But at the time, you know, a lot of people were deeply uncomfortable. I want to just mention we have a few questions coming in from audience members, and I want to just read one here. Luke Johnson, who is a student here at DU, he says, my question is regarding violent protest and the president's capitalization on this protest to reframe the Black Lives Matter movement into a law and order issue. To what extent is the violent protest negative to the general public's opinion of BLM? And do you have any comments surrounding safe civic engagement in the future? I don't know if anyone wants to jump on that.
I guess I'll start with this public opinion question. I mean, the president knows the history of race and racism, and he's looking at other periods in American history where law and order campaigning has been effective for candidates steeped in white supremacy as he is. And so he has a sense that it might work. What the president doesn't seem to recognize is that the times have changed in some important ways, in ways that many of my fellow panelists have highlighted. Like these protest activities, as sort of skeptical of liberal white folks as I am, they turned out in droves for these protests. This is a multiracial, diverse coalition of folks who are recognizing the damage, the real harm that state violence and racial violence does to Black lives. And so here I'd say that I think the president is playing an old game where the rules have changed a little bit. And I don't think that he fully recognizes that. Is the rhetoric good for members of his base? Likely so. I mean, these are folks who, on every measure of racial attitudes that we could look at, we would in political science say that they're racially conservative. If I had a drink, I'd maybe say they're racist. And so, yeah, it works for this set of folk. And that ought not surprise us, but the president is trying to win a general election, and that general election comprises people who have stated allyship with Black folks who recognize the systemic violence. And so I don't think it's going to be as effective as it would be if he wants to broaden his coalition. But I suppose we'll see in a few days.
You didn't even need a drink for that. Apparently that's not even necessary. I'm with you. I think, you know, first of all, it's worth noting that it's not necessarily the case that violent protest is ineffective, right? And so for many of us, for many folks, it may not be ideal. You know, if you had to choose between violent protests and nonviolent protests, you might choose nonviolent protests. I think that's probably the case for most people. But the reality is that nonviolent protest has a role to play, often has a role to play in protest movements, and is often part and parcel of them. And so that's just something to contend with. And the reality of that is underscored by the work of folks like Dan Gillian. And there's an active conversation and debate right now going on, I think I would say, among the political science community about that very issue. That's from a kind of like scholarly perspective. You know, from a kind of more normative perspective, I think there's this reality that Black people have been the victims of and continue to be the victims of violence in massively disproportionate ways for all manner of reasons, most of which are deeply structural. And so there's a painful irony to violence being used as an excuse for undermining protest movements on behalf of Black lives, right? If anyone should be upset about violence, if for anyone there should be a backlash against political movements that entail violence, it should be Black people, because we're the disproportionate victims of violence. And so I think that there's a kind of misunderstanding both of history and of the reality when we try to make it appear as though Black Lives Matter has been sort of the progenitor of violence somehow. You know, if anything, it's the violence that emerges. First of all, we know a lot of the violence that has emerged supposedly in these movements has been concocted by folks other than the Black Lives Matters movement. That the majority of protesting that's going on isn't violent. And so a lot of how we understand violence in this movement is amplified by hyperbole, essentially, and inaccuracy. But on a more foundational level, when we're talking about violence and Black people, I think we always have to stop and reevaluate who ought to be angry, who ought to be upset, who ought to be indignant about the ways that violence is affecting, you know, everyday life in communities.
I can just jump in on this too.
Amen.
Yes. Jamila, you need to come talk to my class. I mean, I'm always also struck by, I think, Luke, it's such an important and interesting question. And of course, it's been talked about a lot, especially this summer. So I do want to underscore that. But it always strikes me in terms of, especially being a political scientist and a student of American political history, the double standard when we talk about violent protests, right? And in that kind of the double standard in terms of when it's borne by Black people in particular, right? We're never like, oh man, those American revolutionaries, oh man, the Civil War, right? That's all violent protests. That's all part of the making of this country, right? But then it's like when Black people burn down a police department, we're like, oh my goodness, all these Black people are distracting from the other good Black people. No, right? What's been fascinating though to me in this moment has been in terms of, I feel like the strength of the narrative around property damage, right? In terms of like the police department went up in flames. Are you more mad that the police department went up in flames? Are you more mad that this other business burned to the ground than you are about the loss of life, right? And that question has been posed in very stark terms in this moment. And many people have had to think about, like they've been trained to think about the loss of property as a violation, as undercutting like the grounds and the merits of protest. But in this moment, we have to ask ourselves, if Black people, as this panel has contended, are being killed every year, all the time, and y'all haven't taken to the streets, then clearly you don't care. And we have to ask ourselves what our priorities actually are. It's also important, you know, there's been work, whether it's by Omar Wassau and Daniel Gillian, that have recently focused on nonviolent and violent protests. But the real work, I mean, I love Dan, right? Omar's fantastic, but the real work is done in history, right? Like Black violent protest has always existed alongside nonviolent protests. Historians on the level of hundreds have made that point. However, the way in which civil rights history is taught and told, K through 12, and in too many college classrooms, is one that is a sanitized version of the civil rights movement, in which violent protest is all of a sudden magically dropped off, and we all of a sudden get the landmark Civil Rights Act in 1964 and the Voting Rights Act in 1965 through Black people getting drinks poured on themselves and on lunch counters. No. That comes because of a tension that is always at play in American politics, right? And so we, I think as a community, as a society, need to really understand that history and sit with what that tension actually means about who we actually are and about the strength of democracy.
So I love everything that Megan and Jamila and Hakeem have said. I also just want to really problematize the idea of like, what are we talking about when we talk about violent protests, right? So one of the things that you can see when you look at this summer's protests is an enormous amount of police violence, to the point where the Denver Police Department was court-ordered to stop using tear gas and rubber bullets, which, like, let's just say courts don't intervene like that all that much, honestly. So that's like really an indicator of the extent to which there was just a massive level of use of force by the police department. And you see that really like all the way across the country. But the narrative that that we're talking about in the context of violent protest is a narrative of something about the behavior of the protesters. The reality is that the police can shape what it looks like when protesters are engaged in protest. They can shape how much violence occurs around a protest. And because of that, they can shape how disruptive a protest looks. Right. And so I don't think that it makes a whole lot of sense to think about the idea of, especially the summer's protests being violent or nonviolent, without thinking about the context of violence that the protesters were facing every day that they went out there. And I also think Megan's point about like, how do we think about whether property destruction is the same thing as violence, right? If you look at violent riots and conflict in American history, honestly, the vast majority of them, and especially the vast majority of what we would think of as race riots, are white people rioting against Black people, right? White people committing like, direct violence against Black people. And that violence can be aimed at things like dispossessing them economically. It can be aimed at keeping them out of segregated neighborhoods. It can be aimed at sort of like George Zimmerman style, like vigilante justice. Not justice, but the sort of like vigilantism about that's discussed as being a matter of public safety and blamed on questions of public safety and justice, but is actually primarily about excluding Black people from white environments and power and economic opportunity. And so when we're thinking about violent protests, people too often talk about that as primarily something that Black or other minoritized communities are engaged in, as opposed to talking about it as something that is also part of majoritarian efforts to, and the efforts of politically powerful people to retain that political power, that political and economic power. And I think what we're seeing, you know, as with the with Kyle Rittenhouse, as with this other, with the kind of threatening behavior of groups of people at polls and election and voting stations, we're seeing people engaged in a variety of kinds of threatening and disruptive behavior in this country. But if the only targets of the law and order rhetoric are Black, we should be thinking about what that means in terms of the plausibility and compellingness of that law and order rhetoric, and the way that it's primarily a political tool, as opposed to an accurate summary or analysis of what's actually going on.
Thank you. We're running a little bit over, but if the panel's okay with it, I'd love to just indulge one more question here. And I thank you for this. We had a comment from Tom Douglas, who asked if any of you are charting changes in BLM allyship since the protest.
So, I mean, we've asked survey questions about this for some pilot work that we're doing. And you see what you see in the national polls. I mean, if allyship means support for the movement, yeah, it's at its peak around the murder of George Floyd, and it's since tapered off a bit. And so, I mean, I was asked by some reporters, given the work that we've been doing at charting public attitudes about this post Michael Brown up to the present day, about what I thought about white people in this movement. And perhaps this is the only through line of my comments today, is I was skeptical then, and I'm skeptical now. I mean, and that skepticism is mostly because we look at history of allyship, and when the rubber hits the road, there are the people who are there at the beginning are not always there at the end. And so I mean, I've been heartened by the amount of allyship we've observed. I don't think we can write that off, and we ought not. And I just commend to folks the great work of my friend and our colleague, Jen Chudy, who's done some great work on thinking about white racial sympathy and distress over Black suffering. And I think we've seen that in this moment, but I think we're going to see the ebbs and flows of white people's allyship. But again, I think that is, as Megan and others have said, is just perhaps the wrong place to focus our attention and our efforts. It's noteworthy for sure, but it's just not the thing that I'd be losing sleep over. We should expect ebbs and flows in white people's commitments to these efforts.
That's a great answer. Thank you. I'm sorry, did anyone else want to follow up on that?
I just think that was the perfect answer, so it's hard to follow up on. The only thing I would add is, and not even add, but extend on, is this notion that you know, allyship, while interesting in some ways and you know, and worth noting, is really different than a kind of material commitment to the redistribution of power and resources. Now, if we redefine allyship to be that, and not a response to, do you agree with Black Lives Matter, or do you support Black Lives Matter as far as a survey question is concerned, but like metrics that really tell us the nature of the commitment to the redistribution of power and resources. And if we pay attention to that, then the politics of those commitments, I think, are much more crucial to the trajectory of racial justice in the US than versus the politics of allyship. The politics of allyship is in some ways superficial and symbolic, right? And much more about white people's feelings than about Black lives, right? The politics of power and resource distribution, that's gonna tell us something about racial justice and Black lives.
Thank you for that. So we are basically out of time here, but I want to thank you all for participating in this. This has been a really good discussion. I should also mention, we've had a really lively chat going on this whole time, filled with all sorts of links and everything. And I want to thank everyone who participated in that. You know, they spared all us, you know, a lot of research on our own. And Hakeem and Laurel and Megan and Jamila, thank you so much for your participation in this. This has been really useful. We hope to have a recording of this available hopefully sometime by next week. You should feel free to watch, share with friends, use in class, whatever you need. I also want to thank Erin Dietrich and Alicia McDowell for helping with all the logistics of this, putting this together, and getting this out there. And thank you all for participating. Thanks to all of you for joining us today. Everyone, stay healthy, stay safe, take care. I know.